Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Thomas Huddleston. I'm the Research Director at the Migration Policy Group, here to welcome you to our joint webinar with SEPS, with PICUM, and with criminalized humanitarians from around Europe to give you an update on what's going on to protect the right to help migrants and refugees around Europe. For this webinar, we're going to be drawing on a lot of really the latest research that's been going on to see where there are criminalization cases around Europe. And we have been bringing this together through Rizoma, the research social platform on migration and asylum. So we're going to give you the latest from the Rizoma research and what we've also been seeing now that we've been under lockdown with COVID. And we're also going to be talking about what can be done to push back against this criminalization. So we're going to be talking to two humanitarians, one in Belgium and one who was criminalized in Greece. And we're going to look into their own experiences and what they've been doing to fight back. And we're going to look more broadly at what we should be doing across the European Union with the EU's new migration pact, with the new commissioner, with the new parliament. You know, what can all of us trying to do to make sure that no one in Europe is criminalized simply for offering humanitarian assistance? So I am going to be taking us through this webinar as the moderator. Just some basic rules. All of you are muted. If you want to participate, you click the Q&A button down at the bottom of your Zoom, and that will send questions to the panelists. I will be collecting your questions for the Q&A section at the end. So feel free to be asking questions already as we go along, and I'll be compiling them together. During this webinar, we really encourage you to share what you're learning, what you're thinking with your friends. So this webinar is being live cast on Facebook and YouTube. And we encourage you to use the hashtag Defend Solidarity so that we can also be resharing some of your comments afterwards. So please use the hashtag Defend Solidarity and link up with all of us at MPG, PICUM, and SEPS on Twitter and on Facebook. So how we're going to work out, I'm going to hand over to our panelists, and then we're going to have a deep Q&A session so that we can really understand how criminalization is evolving across Europe, who's been affected, how things are changing, and really what all of us can do about that. So I'd first like to turn over to Sergio Carrera, who is Senior Research Fellow at SEPS, who has graciously accepted to host this webinar with their facilities. Thank you so much to SEPS, and now for a word of welcome from Sergio.
Thank you, Thomas. It's really a pleasure for SEPS to join again forces with the Migration Policy Group and PICUM in organizing this very timely webinar. So really big thanks to both of you. And I'm also really happy to count with us two of the brave individuals who have been subject to some of these policies that we will be discussing today. Now, why is this important now? We indeed are living in COVID-19 pandemic, and we have seen some EU governments implementing a number of measures, emergency policies, which basically criminalize sometimes freedom of expression and which have an impact on freedom of association, particularly civil society. Now, this is a rule of law issue. It's very important to keep in mind the fundamental role that non-governmental organizations and civil society play in liberal democracies to keep not only, of course, policies and governments accountable, but also as a living expression of human dignity to really provide assistance to those in need, irrespective of their status. And this is an issue not only for some governments, which are currently most discussed, like the one in Hungary or in Poland, but it's for every single EU government, declaring itself or not liberal or illiberal. So the work of Rizoma is extremely important to bring light precisely to these dynamics. Also at SEPS, we have been conducting research, providing evidence-based in cooperation also with PICUM and MPG, on the different modalities, how complex it is to grasp what is really going on when it comes to policing humanitarianism, meaning civil society actors, but also critical citizens who basically provide assistance and help those in need, those in difficulty, but also who are safeguarding the right to life when thinking of search and rescue at sea, for example. And in a context where you have policies which are intentionally, sometimes instrumentally targeting them, trying to really make their job extremely difficult and indirectly and sometimes directly penalizing them in very fundamental ways. Now, in our research, we have identified, of course, and studied, and we will be hearing more today about formal cases of criminalization, meaning penal sanctioning or bringing some of humanitarians and human rights defenders before justice, but also the use of administrative sanctions, financial penalties and so on. But also we have identified other dynamics of policing humanitarianism, including informal policing modalities, which are sometimes also very effective in curtailing the work of civil society, such as intimidation and suspicion, basically labeling in a fundamentally wrong and non-evidence-based way people as criminals or quasi-criminals or smugglers, or harassing civil society workers on the ground, doing very legitimate work, very necessary work on the ground, disciplining them as well through financial requirements or limiting funding to these people. And our research and Rizoma research has brought to light precisely who is more targeted. It's usually, the people who are more critical, the people who also play a more watchdog role, the people who, irrespective of national politics on migration and refugee, they are simply there to provide help to anyone in need. These are the people who, unfortunately, irrespective of the fact that they play such a fundamental role, as I said before, in our democracies, are the first ones suffering and experiencing these consequences. And I'm sure that today we will be exploring the effects, the chilling effects. Sometimes the purpose is basically making life of these people impossible, really exhausting those people, really like chilling effect, making, it feels like indeed someone is being harassed. It's exactly the same feeling. And of course, this creates mistrust, societal mistrust in moments when we actually need mutual trust. We need to work together. We need more solidarity. This is very present in European Union policy making. And I think it's a very strong and important message to keep on insisting that we need measures that build trust and solidarity. So just to conclude, I think that it is also very important to have a very detailed understanding and assessment, country-specific in the EU, of the exact dynamics and implementations of these policies, because it's very difficult to grasp. Sometimes it's hidden. So, and this is something that Rizoma has contributed to very well, and I hope that we will be able to continue with this work in the near future.
Thank you so much, Sergio. Indeed, you can go into that first discussion brief from Rizoma that really talked about, as you say, all of the impacts that this has, not just on the people who are criminalized, but on the migrants and refugees that they are working with, and for all of us who want to see the European Union function with normal, humane migration policies. Now, we want to now really look at what is this issue, who is it affecting, and what has been changing over the past few years. And to really look at that, we turn to PICUM, the Platform for International Cooperation on Documented Migrants, who really has been putting this issue on the agenda for decades and have put it on the agenda of all of our organizations. So I turn to Michel Lesvos, Director of PICUM, to give us the background on how has this emerged across Europe. Michel, over to you.
Thanks very much, Tomas, and really great to be doing this together with MPG and SEPS and to continue what we've been working on for a couple of years already. So I wanted to start off by saying that even though we will hear more in depth on these particular cases, we have on this call people who are criminalized, and this is a huge phenomenon nowadays. It's not a new phenomenon. So criminalization of solidarity towards undocumented migrants has been a reality in the EU for as long as the EU has had a common and asylum and migration policy, which has been since 1999. We just celebrated, in the sense last year, the 20th anniversary of this common policy. Nearly 20 years ago, when the EU Facilitation Directive was adopted in 2002, the UNHCR and the European Parliament already criticized some of the provisions of that directive, fearing that at that time that it could lead to criminalization of humanitarian workers and human rights defenders. And my organization, PICUM, at the same time was going through a process where we were gathering information about cases on the ground before the directive was adopted in 2002 and right afterwards. And this was the findings of the Book of Solidarity. And we found by looking at roughly 10 EU member states that there was an alarming tendency already at the time to criminalize assistance to undocumented migrants. Since that time, there have been more than hundreds of individuals who've been criminalized all over the EU for rescuing migrants at sea, for giving food and water to people in distress, for providing shelter or rental accommodation, for informing migrants about their rights. And for many years, there was no centralized data collection on these cases. So it was kind of hard to monitor all this in a comprehensive way. And that's why we were very grateful to be all working together in this Rhizoma project where we could gather and monitor this. And Rhizoma has concluded that since 2015, when we saw so many more people arriving in Europe and also so many more asking for asylum or other protection and not being granted it and not being returned, that in this whole 5-year plus period, more than 170 people have been criminalized during this period. So what do we think the reasons are for this trend to criminalization of solidarity? I would say briefly 3. First, the criminalization of solidarity with migrants is linked to the criminalization of migration itself. The Fundamental Rights the Fundamental Rights Agency did a study in 2014, and they saw that there were 25 member states who were criminalizing irregular entry and stay. Now we would say, because the UK is out, that there are currently 24 member states who have legislation or a fine that criminalizes entry or stay. The second reason is that in recent years, there's been an increase in xenophobic discourse, and there's been a whole climate of suspicion against NGOs and volunteers helping migrants. NGOs have been accused of, quote, collusion with migrant smuggling, unquote, by the Italian prosecutor Carmelo Zuccato. NGOs have been accused of, quote, encouraging human trafficking, unquote, by the Maltese Prime Minister Joseph Muscat. NGOs have been accused of, quote, being a pull factor for migrants by Frontex Director Fabrice Leggeri, and this pull factor has been also disproved by various studies. A third reason why there has been this increase in criminalization is due to the legal framework, and I think we'll hear about this later as well from other speakers. We've seen, and this also backs up what Sergio has also just said previously, that through the Rhizoma research, that even though a lot of the actual cases have resulted, thankfully, in acquittals, the harm is greater than the judicial process. The harm is done to the good reputation of NGOs and individuals, and we'll hear more about this from Anouk and Sean's cases. So in many cases, and this is also what Sergio said, the end goal doesn't actually seem to be the actual conviction in a court case, but it's a wider chilling effect on life-saving activities. By example, confiscating NGO vessels or intimidating people to provide shelter in their homes. And this can be linked to the EU Facilitation Directive of 2002, which defines the crime of facilitation of unauthorized entry, transit, and residence. So Contrary to the UN migrant smuggling protocol, which in a sense was the global instrument, and the facilitation directive was how the EU transposed the global instrument, the UN instrument, the smuggling protocol, says that the facilitation of irregular entry must be criminalized when there's material or financial benefit. But the EU directive criminalizes the facilitation of irregular entry even when there's no financial or material benefit. So in a nutshell, the UN protocol says people who help migrants to enter into a country in an irregular way should be penalized if they make a profit. The EU says anyone who's helping people to enter the EU without a valid document can be criminalized. And what has happened then is that national laws transposing the EU directive have criminalized search and rescue NGOs who brought rescued migrants ashore for humanitarian motives. It's interesting to see that the same facilitation directive on the EU level has an exemption for humanitarian actors, but it's optional and it's adopted only in 7 EU member states. In 5 out of the 7 countries, including Greece and Belgium, even with this humanitarian exception, it has not prevented criminalization of humanitarian actors. And we'll hear this from Anouk and Sean's cases. So just to conclude on this European part of it, the European Commission has been called on by the European Parliament to review the situation of this directive and to introduce guidelines that would protect humanitarian activities and the right to help. I would also just conclude by saying briefly, the criminalization has not stopped during COVID, during the pandemic. It has continued. In April last month, Greece published a new joint ministerial decision, which regulates NGOs working in the field of migration. And this actually makes it much harder for NGOs to register, to certify their work when they're working on migration. And in a sense, it has a chilling effect. We've heard in France, in Calais, that volunteers from the organization Utopia 56 and Auberge des Migrants were fined because they were providing support to migrants living in informal camps. On Friday, the 24th of April, 4 members of Utopia 56 were arrested for one day because they were filming the evacuation of a migrants camp in Grand Centre. And lastly, and I'll end here, the ship Ellen Curdy was placed just last week under an administrative stop while the Italian Coast Guard inspects suspicions of irregularities of a technical and operational nature. And so the CI ship noted that the ship has undergone 4 inspections in Italy and Spain in the past 16 months, where on the other hand, it's quite common for coastal states to inspect other states' ships only once a year. So we see that even in this lockdown, there are still the continuation. I will stop here and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Michelle. I might come back to you more about the criminalization dynamics that your members are seeing even during this lockdown, but I think you were really useful to remind us that this is a long-standing old piece of EU law that has allowed these cases to continue to evolve and to allow legislation also to create all this vagueness. And this is where we really were when we started working together with you at the Migration Policy Group, trying to look at what are the specific cases, because when we started this about 2 years ago, there wasn't a lot of information and people were even saying, I don't think that criminalization is really happening. You read about it once or twice and maybe in a few countries, but it's not an EU-wide phenomenon. So we at MPG have been able to, with all of you and with the criminalized humanitarians, look at what those cases are. And that's what my colleague, Dr. Carmina Conte, is now going to present. Really, what is happening on criminalization, in which countries, who is this affecting? So to really show us the extent of this. Carmina, I believe you have some statistics to show us.
Thanks, Thomas. I have a very short presentation where I will show briefly. So as you said, how many cases of criminalization of solidarity we have identified during our Rizoma research project, and where these cases took place in the member state. So as of December 2019, the research of Rizoma found that at least 171 individuals and have been criminalized and have been involved in at least 60 cases of investigation or criminal prosecution on the grounds falling under the material scope of the Facilitation Directive. So we are talking about facilitation of entry, of stay, residence, transit of irregular migrants into the member states. So this overview represents a wide scale of different experience of the divergent implementation of anti-smuggling policies in Europe. And we have identified these cases in at least 13 European countries. On what ground did these cases took place? The majority of cases were based on the facilitation of entry or transit, so 44 cases. For instance, the case of the Briançon that were prosecuted for assisting the illegal entry of migrants between the Italian and the French border during a protest in 2018, and they were also sentenced. 10 cases were based on the crime of facilitation of residence. Emblematic is the case of German pastors that were granting sanctuary to Sudanese refugees, and they have been investigated for this reason. In 6 cases, we have identified that the crimes of facilitation were aggravated by multiple accusation and grounds, such as money laundering, membership of criminal organization, espionage, or improper use of documentation. As our research shows, the cases increased exponentially after 2015, when only 15 individuals were under investigation for human smuggling. And in 2018, more than 100 people were involved in investigation or even in criminal prosecution. At the same time, the number of sea and land migrant arrivals decreased during this the same time frame between 2015 and 2019. So I will conclude this small presentation by highlighting in which country these cases took place. As you can see, 13 European countries have been involved, and not only the countries that are the external border of the European Union, such as Greece, Italy, but also countries that usually are a final destination. For instance, Sweden, France, Germany, that adopt very restrictive policies in the management of the internal borders. So to give some example, in Greece, we have more than 50 people under investigation. The case of Sean is very emblematic, and he will explain more in details the case. But there have been other cases, for instance, the case of Premade Team Humanity that were prosecuted but acquitted in 2018. And Italy is the second country most affected, with 39 individuals investigated. The most recent case is the case of Carola Rackete, that was put under investigation after disembarking 40 people in Sicily. She was released, and also the Court of Cassation in Italy confirmed her acquittal because she was acting on humanitarian ground to save life. The third country that has been affected by Criminalisation of Solidarity is France. I would like to highlight briefly the case of Pierre Mannoni, that is a French teacher researcher who was arrested in 2016 for giving a lift in his car to 3 Eritrean women, and the court of first instance actually ruled that he was helping the women to protect their dignity, so he was acquitted. But then the case was appealed, and he was sentenced to 2 months by the court. And then, despite the Court of Cassation quashed the sentence, is again under trial, and he will be tried again in the next month by the Lyon Court of Appeal in France. So these are just some of the cases that we have identified. So I would like to conclude by saying that our research showed that since 2015, there was a tenfold escalation of judicial prosecution and investigation of people helping migrants, despite a decrease in irregular arrivals in the member states. And target of criminalization are mostly NGOs, volunteers, journalists, mayors, religious leaders. And we, as was already mentioned, we identified that because of the taxation package, national laws dealing with smuggling provides a very wide margin of appreciation to the member states to decide what is humanitarian assistance and what is migrant smuggling, and therefore increasing the risk for people helping migrants to be criminalized. So I'd like to thank you for your attention. If you need more information about the case, you can reach us at any time.
Thank you so much, Carmina. And a few of you have asked if we can share slides of participants. I'm just going to confirm that with all of them and then make sure that they get out to you. But you can also find this research and a really good infographic summarizing all of the research that we've gathered together on the rizoma.eu website. So this kind of gives you the overall trends, and through working together, researchers and NGOs, it's been really great to be able to work directly with people who are facing criminalization, to give them this information, to get other information for them, to put them together, to come up with new strategies, and to also help them get their stories out and the stories of other people, so that we can all celebrate, like some of us might have done yesterday when Cédric Guérou had all of his charges dismissed by the Lyon Appeals Court. So hopefully we will also have good news to celebrate in the future with Anouk and with Sean, and that all of us can do what we can to help them, but also others, refugees, migrants, EU citizens. So we just wanted to give the space now to Anouk and then to Sean to share their experiences, what they've been doing, what they found most effective, and what they would really like you to do in the future. So over to Anouk. Anouk, you are muted. You have to unmute yourself.
Unmute myself?
There you go. Now you're fine.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So hello, everybody. So my story is a simple story, but very effective on my moral status. I'm a journalist, and 3 years ago, well, my story started 5 years ago in the jungle of Calais, where I went and I saw like a human discharge. You know, people were living on a slut, and so it started. I just thought this was not possible, and so I invest myself in finding solution. And this is the first time when I gave shelter to one young Syrian. And after that, the Calais jungle was dismantled and the refugee came to Brussels in the famous Parc Maximilien. And one day I saw on the news the police coming to that park and rushing all those people out of the park and taking what their belongings, what the little they had, they were taking off them. And so the next day I went there and we gave food, we talked to them, we tried to find solution. And there was a little boy who was 16 by that time. He was Sudanese and he had a broken hand. And so I said, okay, just come with me, I will help you a little. And this is how my problem started, because he came home, I gave him food, one bed for a night, and normally I should say, okay, you go back to park. But he was 16 and I didn't have the heart to do that. So I sheltered him, and after 1 or 2 months, you know about the Dublin protocol. So he was Dublined, sorry, in Italy. So Belgium, we don't accept people who were Dublined and they would be brought back to Italy. So that was not possible for him. So I tried to find a solution for him to go to Great Britain, which was the El Dorado for them. And by giving one telephone to one person, she was on tape, recorded by the police. Voilà, I asked if she knew someone who could help us. And I think 1 month later, I had like 7 policemen who came into my house, who took all my telephone, computer, everything that was linked to my work. And I was convicted for human trafficking and for international criminal association, which is quite a lot. So 10 years of jail and a lot of money to pay. And my trial began, and it was I don't know, it's so difficult to explain because this trial has been postponed. Finally, we were acquitted 2 years later, and the prosecutor went on appeal. And normally my case should have been decided finally on the 4th and the 5th of May, but what happened because of the COVID, it has been again postponed until March 2021. So voila, it is like a torture, a moral torture. You have something pending on you, you cannot get your life back. But for me, I have taken a lot of force. It has become something that I want to fight. And for me, what I expect from everybody is not giving the people who want to criminalize reason to do that and fight back and say, okay, humanity, solidarity are values that we cannot forget. So this is about it.
Thank you so much, Anouk, and I know how much you've done in Belgium, all of you who are facing these charges, to raise awareness, to mobilize citizens, to get your stories out there. It has really inspired us, and we hope that we can also support others across Europe who can learn from some of the very effective strategies that I hope will continue to work out and will not stop Belgians from being afraid to offer humanitarian assistance. Thank you. So now over to Sean, who's joining us from Ireland, but about Greece, one of the many examples of mobile EU citizens who took up the call in 2015-16 to go and help at the Mediterranean, and didn't receive at some point the warmest welcome from authorities. And I know you're not the only one, Sean, so if you could share what you're still going through in Greece, what others are, and what you would recommend for others to be doing.
Sure, yeah. I'm going to use the assistance of some slides to put those up now. I want to talk a little bit about my experience in the so-called migrant crisis, and that begins on Lesvos. Lesvos is a primary entry point, as many of you know, for people seeking asylum in Europe. And this is where I went to volunteer as a rescue coordinator, because I have search and rescue training and things like that. So I coordinated the medical and the offshore and onshore responses to folks who were in distress. Most of them were asylum seekers. So to quickly kind of talk about what that looked like when I was there. In 2018, when I was active on the island, we worked along the shoreline. Moria was one of the primary hotspots, and it had 6,500 people living there. It was about over 300% over capacity. And so essentially what happens in this context is that asylum seekers make this dangerous journey, and has been alluded to before. They are often undertaking these journeys in incredibly dangerous circumstances. And so that is why civilian search and rescue was so necessary on the island. And on the southern shoreline where I coordinated, we were 4 organizations who provided medical, interpretation, and rescue vehicles to assist. And despite that kind of assistance, the conditions in and around Moria and on Lesbos in general actually created and exacerbated the mental health conditions, as was stated by a number of researchers. And it's really important to note that the conditions were at the time, and still are, completely inadequate to deal with the numbers of people who are arriving. And so I really want to ground the idea that, in fact, search and rescue, civilian participation in trying to assist people is incredibly necessary, and in most cases it is done shoulder to shoulder with the authorities. So oftentimes we talk about this tension, and indeed, in my experience, was always working in conjunction with the authorities. Now, despite that cooperation, I was arrested, and I spent over 100 days in pre-trial detention, in prison essentially, for a number of incredibly heinous charges that we are still facing. They are providing immediate assistance to migrant smuggling networks. being part of a criminal organization, money laundering, espionage, forgery, among others. And in fact, the combined sentence of this would span into the coming centuries, and we still face 25 years in prison. And I think people often see this as being incredibly dramatic, which it of course it is, but it isn't all that uncommon. And I kind of want to ground what these accusations actually amount to when compared with the evidence that is raised against us. So just to unpick some of those accusations, and because it's an ongoing case, I can only speak about what has already been published. Human Rights Watch published a report while we were in prison, which essentially concluded that the prosecution seeks to criminalize saving lives. And I think that very succinctly kind of captures what we have experienced. So when we're accused of things like espionage, what they say is, Sean, you and your colleagues used encrypted communication services. And this is evidence that we were trying to hide information from the authorities. What they don't tell the prosecution is what they're referring to is in fact WhatsApp. The use of WhatsApp in this case is evidence that we are spies, which is of course preposterous. Another thing, and it's a bit more technical, is that the police allege that we assisted illegal entry. This is allowing people to cross into Europe without being detected by the authorities. Now they say that we were doing that, we were essentially smuggling people who are asylum seekers. Now, by definition, an asylum seeker is exempt from this illegal entry. And so there are a number of internal contradictions in the accusations which we face. And those are very important to identify and to allow us to begin unpicking and kind of challenging the narratives that we face. And as it was alluded to before, the point of these prosecutions, at least in my experience, hasn't necessarily been to find folks guilty. It has been sufficient to engage people in these lengthy and very costly legal battles. And so, although this evidence will not stand in court, it has been enough to implement this chill factor, this idea that people are actually afraid, civilian search and rescuers are afraid of participating in very necessary search and rescue, for instance, or even just handing out blankets or water or any other medical assistance. So when we compare before our arrest to what's happening now on the island, I think there's a stark contrast. Despite being already very poor, Moria now houses over 20,000 asylum seekers. Remember, it was already way over the allocated spaces in 2018. Now we have 20,000 people. Many folks are not permitted to leave their point of first arrival. So we have tonight, people will be sleeping cold on the beach because they're not permitted to leave. And this comes at a time after prosecutions like ours, where we were 4 or 5 certified NGOs doing bona fide rescue work. Now there are none. And there are none, and I've spoken to people who used to do search and rescue, and they've said things like, we cut our operations because we cannot risk the lengthy court battles. So again, that's a chill factor. So we have no more search and rescue, we have no interpreters, we have very few medical resources. And this comes at a time, as of yesterday, there are 2 confirmed cases of COVID-19. And again, completely inadequate services available to these people. I think, and another thing that I want to really drive home is that this concerns all of us. Even here in Ireland, this is important. It concerns us all because we often have these very polarizing conversations, but when you get down to the very core of what's happening here, it can affect us all. So imagine that you arrive at the scene of a car accident and you notice someone in need of help. And this is essentially what we did. If you check their pulse before you check their passport, you're potentially committing the same kind of crime that we are. And this is despite the fact that according to international law, according to European Union legislation, according to our fundamental values here in the European Union, it is important to provide assistance to people in distress. And I think it's really important that we can kind of bring it back to that core message. What I've noticed in moving forward and communicating what's happening is that we need to have a very rational conversation around what is actually occurring and being able to kind of pull away some of the conversations that we have around the fear of migration and begin talking about the fact that irrespective of who is making a journey across the border, they are entitled to at least be treated with respect, dignity, and have access to healthcare. And so that kind of brings us on to what I think we can do. And I've worked with MPG and other organizations around increasing participation in European elections. As was identified, a lot of this legislation really comes from the European Union. And so that is definitely a vehicle that we can use, European elections and such things. I think I'm running out of time, so I will leave it there and happily answer questions if there are any later on.
Great, thank you everyone. Definitely send in your questions. I've just been connecting them to the panelists with our own internal system. So keep them coming about not only individual cases that you know of and you want some idea about what strategy they can use, but also what can be done by your national governments or at the EU level. And please continue to share either what you're hearing or what you're thinking on Twitter or on Facebook. Remember, the hashtag is Defend Solidarity. So here you get an overview of the cases that are still coming in every day. And while we hear about some victories like Wesedi Gehu, we have others who are languishing and are losing their time, losing their money, losing their energy. And are looking for solutions wherever they can. So what particularly can we expect from the EU level? What could be done by either EU policymakers or by civil society coming together or by lawyers doing strategic litigation? So for that, I turn to the person who for me is actually one of the most expert people on criminalization of solidarity, and that's Lina Vosilite from SEPS. So Lina, turn over to you.
Hello, everyone. And it seems we really painted kind of a gloomy picture. So let's try to bring a bit bright colors. I have some behind me, but let's try to unpick what can EU citizens, lawyers, and civil society, as well as EU policymakers, what we all together can do. So first of all, we can, or as EU citizens, you can get informed, learn more about what's happening in your own country as well in across the EU, and we are providing some links to our research. Welcome to use it. Also, we encourage you to come together, because when we come together as citizens or as together with civil society, then our voice starts to matter. So you can mobilize together with your national human rights platforms for upholding migrant rights and human dignity, as well joining some European campaigns. Also, as EU citizens, you can demand accountability of your own national governments, as well as EU institutions, that all what they do is in line with the fundamental rights, including the human dignity that we heard a lot. And as EU citizen, you have a right to submit a petition to the European Parliament if you see something is going wrong. And you can also use some of the platforms to alert about various violations. Then what we should do once it happens to us, to our organizations, so criminalized individuals and their lawyers actually can do a lot by trying to reframe the claims. We saw a lot that in these cases, when lawyers are simply trying to battle back against not being a smuggler, there is not much what you can gain. It's only acquittal that you can get. However, when portraying the situation as attack on human rights defenders, kind of opens new channels. And here we have, for example, possibility to use UN human rights declaration of human rights defenders. There is a special rapporteur at UN level where lawyers and civil society can submit their complaints. There is also various mechanisms if people, like we heard of Sean being held in detention for more than 100 days. For example, UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention could intervene in such procedures and investigate whether this detention has been necessary and proportionate. Similarly, at the Council of Europe level, we have the court, European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, who can also check whether what has been done is in line with the European Convention of Human Rights and whether other rights such as privacy, family life, freedom of association or assembly have not been violated in the meanwhile. And finally, we can also turn to the EU. We have a court in Luxembourg, Court of Justice of the EU, that can assess whether national laws that are transposing EU regulations or directives are in compliance with the fundamental rights charters and the EU principles. Also, EU supervisory institutions such as Ombudsman or Court of Auditors are looking whether good administration is observed, also whether EU funds are being spent in line with the EU values. Similarly, and I mentioned already that the petition, actually we found that lawyers could more strategically use the right to petition and to kind of inform European Parliament by documenting these violations, by sending these petitions to the Parliament and showing that actually human rights defenders have been criminalized across the EU. And so European parliamentarians could go themselves and carry out field visits and investigate such situations. Then we turn to EU policymakers. So we heard a lot from Michelle and Sergio about the facilitation directive and how this vague definition is actually impacting people. So first of all, EU legislators in line with better regulation and better legislation guidelines should make it sure that EU facilitation directive is precise enough and is clear for those who need to implement what is not a crime, as Carmine mentioned. So we need to narrow the definition itself and to bring it back with the UN migrant smuggling protocol. Secondly, European Commission already started to work on exemption of human rights defenders and humanitarian actors from prosecution according to facilitators package. Nevertheless, it's still not clear how it's going to look. So civil society and academia are really looking that not only well-established international NGOs would be exempted, but also like citizens, volunteers, activists like Sean and Anouk would also be exempted for simple acts of kindness and compassion. Finally, European Parliament could also launch an inquiry and to look into criminalization of solidarity and why, for example, there have been so many state prosecutors' appeals against acquittals, positive decisions that a person has been innocent. Isn't that form of judicial harassment? European Parliament has tools to look into that. And then if we zoom out and get a bit of a bigger picture, EU itself or EU would need to make sure that member states themselves are complying with fundamental rights charter, rule of law, and also ensuring democratic accountability. Therefore, we need the kind of ongoing mechanism that would make a check whether member states are still doing it. Then we also would need to kind of to develop a guidelines to respect, protect, and promote human rights defenders, because they are no longer issue of external world. There are human rights defenders within the EU, and they need to be protected. And EU legislators should step it up. And then we also would really like to see EU Fundamental Rights Agency. It has done tremendous work in documenting all the accusations, disciplining actions, and criminalization of rescue NGOs. However, we feel that this could go one step further, also to kind of capture other modes of policing humanitarianism that are more informal in between, such as disciplining, harassment, intimidation, mere suspicion or surveillance, which is very beginning of this. And the last but not the least, especially in this COVID-19 situation, it's really necessary to strengthen civil society actors via dedicated EU funding, especially to enable them to litigate, to conduct their work, to be the watchdogs. So this is all from us and from our research, and we are happy to share with you more, and maybe we are all in this together, and I'm looking for your questions and comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lina. So we have a lot of people in the audience who are working on this as individuals, activists, organizations, people I can see from EU institutions. So we've got a lot of good questions, and I want to make sure that they're listened to. So I'm going to try and match them as well as I can to our speakers and give you a minute to answer. And if you keep on going, I might say that I'll put you in touch bilaterally. So first question actually is to Sergio. This question comes from Chiara, who says, Anouk and Sean's cases are examples of how the facilitation directive's implementation has been deeply endorsed by states through their national policies. In many of the rulings that we see at the national level, there hasn't really been reference to the facilitations directive. Therefore, the European Court of Justice has not been brought into the matter. Are there reasons for this? Or is this a problem? Is this something that we can do?
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you for this question. I think our research has showed that the facilitators package is a wonderful example of worst regulation. Worst regulation in the sense that it is not only unclear, as we've discussed today, the exact scope of the humanitarian exception, but also we see examples of bad implementation. So if indeed the European Commission considers that it is not permitted that states should exempt civil society and human rights defenders from being criminalized in the context of facilitation of entry, residence, and transit, this means that member states that are doing so are in violation of EU law. Now, the problem there is that we are looking at an old third pillar instrument. It's a framework decision, it's in combination of a directive. It was adopted in a very non-community method framework, and it is a bad law. The European Parliament was criticizing even at that time how badly framed that legislation is, which leaves, of course, also difficulty at times of reaching courts. Now, what we've said is that there should be at least legally binding guidelines by the European Commission, really saying what is not smuggling, what should not be considered as smuggling, and also Lisbonizing this instrument. We can no longer live in a framework decision on third pillar. This needs to be Lisbonized for the sake of clarity and consistency of EU law, and really in compliance with better regulation at EU level.
Right, thank you, Sergio. And I would say if people are interested more in these different policy options, they should go into the Rizoma policy option brief that goes into some of these details. My next question are from Michelle. We have from EU Red Cross Office, Anais, asking for any latest news that you're getting from members about different cases of criminalization. You started to talk a little bit about that, so I'll give you the chance if you want to say more about how the criminalization dynamics are different under lockdown. But a broader question as well from Begum Bastas, saying that the criminalization of solidarity, it's not just targeting humanitarian individuals, but also human rights defenders who are doing their work inside the EU, but also outside the EU. So how can human rights defenders, these invisible fighters sometimes, be better protected? And we have a similar question from Sarah Brooks asking, well, how can we actually better disseminate and popularize this concept, and what's going on to human rights defenders in this crackdown on solidarity? So since your organization works not only on advocacy, but communications, I thought you might have some ideas there.
Thanks a lot. I think those are great questions. I might just start with the human rights defenders one. Actually, I think Sean's description is the clearest of what do you do if someone has suffered a car accident, and do you go and you try and help them until you wait until an ambulance comes, and then while you're doing that, do you check their passport or not? And so I think that this example shows that the issue that we're talking about is most likely the simplest in communications of any of the issues on migration that we deal with. It's assistance, it's saving lives, it's pulling people out of sea because they're drowning, it's taking a person in their car over a mountain because they might suffer from hypothermia. It's, as Anouk was saying, helping a child because they are a child and they have a broken wrist. So I think we think that there has always been a strong sense of solidarity amongst this whole issue. And this most likely has also resulted in a lot of press. Because the press actually has picked up on a lot of these cases and shown the humanity of the actions, and it's the issues of migration in a sense in its simplest form of just helping another person. So there's a lot of potential, but it really means that we need to have more information. So we need to continuously spread information about cases. When we were doing the Rizoma research, one of the most recent gatherings that we had, I think last year, with some of the lawyers concerned, showed that even the data that we've collected is most likely only the tip of the iceberg, because we haven't yet received much information. And I think this was also one of the questions. There are other cases that are not necessarily under the protocol of smuggling, or they're not being charged under that framework. So how do we capture all of that information? So this is especially important going forward, because we need to build on the evidence that we have so far, which we still think is an undercount. And I think also leading them to the issue of human rights defenders, as Lena was saying in her presentation just now at the end, and within the EU framework, the human rights defenders concept has essentially been developed towards the outside the EU. It's been developed by the External Action Service, and it really, in a sense, establishes guidelines and minimum standards for countries outside the EU on how they enable human rights defenders to do the work. How can this be better defined within the EU? I think this is the question for us, because the EU actually has guidelines. It has means to really ensure good standards for human rights defenders. And so maybe we also need to be working more collaboratively amongst civil society organizations that do work in these areas. One example was the organization Kiza in Cyprus, which has been harassed for more than a decade because of its long-standing work on migrants' rights. And they had recognition from a major human rights defenders organization a couple of years ago because of their ongoing work and their ongoing criminalization. And just also briefly, we have not heard as many input from our members about kind of an increase of cases in criminalization during lockdown, but we have seen some examples. There was an NGO in Barcelona about, I think in March, that was given a potential fine for giving food to people who needed it during COVID. So I think that once again, the communications element of this is, obviously we know migrants are suffering enormously because of the lockdowns. So food is crucial. So supporting someone by giving them food is necessary, and then criminalizing them is the extreme shown of a lack of humanity. So I'll just end it there for lack of time.
But it's a good point. And if any of you have cases that you know about, do send it to PICUM, MPG, or SEPS, because we are continuing this monitoring. And some of you have done that. So I'm going to turn to Sean and to Anouk as well, because you are in the midst also of thinking about strategy, and you've been the one actually linking us up with a lot of other criminalized humanitarians. So I'm just going to give you three questions that we had, and if you have strategic ideas or that you're using yourselves or you heard, please let us know. So one question comes in asking about this case in Malta of the MV Lifeline ship that's had to go to the Court of Appeal to appeal the original decision. Has there been a trend that criminalized citizens have had to appeal their convictions. And often criminalized citizens have to rely on representation from NGO lawyers. Is that also really common, or is it really a struggle to get enough legal representation? So that's one question from Malta, if you're interested in it. Another question that I wanted to bring in comes from the civil society Mediterranean search and rescue community that has often faced intimidation because of administrative paperwork, that the ships don't have the right paperwork, or they don't fit the environmental laws or the financial irregularities. But this doesn't seem to really fit exactly in what the EU regulates, this facilitations package. So is there some other tactic that can be done to deal with that issue? And one last question. We've talked a lot about helping, saving people. And just a question that was asked was, do you see also in a country like Belgium that people are facing criminalization for helping people to cross the border or facilitate illegal entry? Because we mostly hear about that in places like Italy or France or the border. So Sean, Anouk, if you want to share any of your experiences or advice on any of these questions.
I think that Sean will be the best person to talk about what's happening in the Mediterranean. So I'll let him talk first, and I will talk about the Belgium situation after.
Thank you for that vote of confidence. I'm not sure I have too much to say on the specific question in Malta, but I would say that it kind of echoes some of the things that colleagues of mine have said, and that is, and really comes back to this chill factor, is the idea of the question relating to having lawyers and the appeals process. It seems to me that, as I said before, it really is enough to put these lengthy and costly processes in front, or even just threaten them, to already dissuade people from participating in this kind of sanctioned work, like providing search and rescue or handing out blankets or whatever it might be. So certainly I think having lawyers and the question was specifically, is it difficult to find appropriate lawyers, or people are relying on NGO lawyers? That's, I suppose the NGOs that come to my mind would be like legal aid NGOs to asylum seekers. That would be different law that doesn't really apply to the criminal prosecutions that people are facing in Greece, for instance. So they tend to be different lawyers, and therefore they tend to be costly lawyers. And again, that dissuades people from participating because they don't feel, although there is a lot of support available to NGOs and to individuals who engage in this kind of work, they feel that the risk is too high. And so again, imposing just a bit of it and making an example of, a large number, but a relatively small number of humanitarian actors is already sufficient. I think that would be my answer to that. In question relating to what can we do if it exists outside of the law? And I think relates a little bit to intimidation as well. What can we do? What kind of tools can be utilized? As I said before, I think that participating in the electoral process is a useful mechanism that we can all engage in, and I think that's something that we haven't perhaps done sufficiently. I certainly have learned a lot in the last few years about my voice in democratic society. I would say that one of the core issues for me that I've noticed is one of messaging, as Michelle Lavoie has already said, is that, and I think that I haven't been able to do, is find the exact message that if you place this, or if you place what's happening on a political spectrum, then you have extreme voices on either side, and they are fairly oppositional. What I've been able to do is find a narrative that is true, but that everyone can identify as being inherently true. That, irrespective of who you are, no one deserves to drown in the ocean. Messages like that are hugely important. So finding a narrative that works, for me, has been kind of the most important avenue outside of the very obvious legal and I suppose lobbying tools that we can use. That's what I would say. Thank you for the question.
Anouk?
Yes, for me, the situation is like that in Belgium. We are not part of NGO, so we have to take care of all the lawyers and everything that is impacting, of course. We pay the lawyers and etc. So we are 4 in my trial, and for some of the people, it is really like a catastrophe, a financial catastrophe. So in Belgium, people, there is some people who gathered to help us and to make a petition and to make a crowdfunding to be able to pay, etc. What I really want, because this is, I think, one of the biggest problems, for the moment, no one of these cases has been in front of le Parlement Européen, le Parlement, and I wish one case would be so that we finally could have one statement for all Europe countries to say what will be the situation for people like us and what we do risk, because this was a question also that I saw. Most of the people don't know what they risk by helping, and this is not clear in one country from another. Nobody knows exactly what we can do, what we cannot do.
Absolutely. And I know that this whole process has gotten you also out and communicating, and also, as Sean said, involved in elections, because I think I voted for you in the last Belgian elections. So it's a great example how all of us become active, and it brings us into many different types of work. But coming back maybe more to the legal strategies, I turn over to Lina. So I don't know if you have anything you want to add on some of these questions about legal strategies. We also had some questions about advocacy strategies. You know, is facilitating the reforming the facilitations directive a short-term or a longer-term priority? What do you know are the next steps at the EU level? And are there other developments that you're expecting? For example, with the Sadiq Yahoo case in France, you know, what is this going to mean for future cases in France? So any other, you know, legal developments that you can key us into at the national or EU level in a minute would be welcome.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for excellent questions. So let's just start from question on facilitation directive and guidelines. So guidelines for sure, maybe a very short-term goal, but they keep us focused that we want to remind the EU legislators and national border enforcement officials, law enforcement officials, that whatever they are doing, it should be done in line with the fundamental rights. So therefore, it would be very good reminder for practitioners to exempt humanitarian actors and those who are upholding human dignity. Then Mark Tilley has highlighted rightly that many of intimidation and harassment and suspicion cases are falling outside of the scope of facilitation directive. However, we should be very cautious not to overlook that the very intention or the very framing is linked back to this facilitation directive. For example, that for law enforcement, for police to deploy secret agents to infiltrate and search and rescue boats, you cannot do it without having some criminal law in your backup that you are kind of that you can use it. And all this framing that it's not clear who are these people, but that they are not migrant smugglers. It's in a long run undermining and escalating activities, harassment, intimidation against those volunteers and citizens. Because in our empiric research that we've done in Greece and Italy, we saw that prosecutions also didn't start it from one day to another. There has been a lot of suspicion, distrust within society, especially between law enforcement and those humanitarians. And only then it slowly built up. It started checking tickets, car parking, whether vessels are registered, whether it's a correct flagship state, and so on. And this added up and kind of in the very end culminated with the criminal case of being whether or not these people are migrant smugglers. But we have to see that logic and all the analysis is done within this frame, and therefore it's very very difficult, and we really need to remedy this. And linking back to human rights defenders and Sarah's question, and also it's very important to see from the human rights defenders approach, because and to have some kind of guidelines. OSCE or DEAR guidelines are saying very clearly any legal provisions that directly or indirectly lead to criminalization of human rights defenders should be immediately remedied. And, you know, like states should also should create a environment that is conducive to human rights work. And I think we really need to have it very clear and to start raising it up. And then very final on Chiara's question regarding Cédric Herrou ruling and the Pierre Manoni case. Actually, they are, and whether or not they are related, actually we saw that it has been really related, because Cédric Herrou case has been made on the basis of facilitation of entry. So kind of the court said, when it comes to facilitation of entry and residence, when people are already here in France, fraternity principle must apply and it needs to be upheld. However, they left it kind of vague and open whether the same principle applies to facilitation of entry, bringing people or transiting people into France. And here we had Manoni's cases coming in because he's seen as facilitating transit, or also Briançon 7 case was also related to that. And kind of prosecutors tried to attack all this mobilization by kind of slapping onto mobilizations that have been happening in these border areas of France. So also by portraying all the Wale as rebel Wale, and kind of trying to portray and appeal as many times, like Manoni case has been appealed 4 times by state prosecutors. So it's showing that maybe it's not the initial case that got this attention, but the kind of escalating discussion and discourse around this case and mobilizations are the things, in fact, that prosecutors are the most afraid. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Lina. I wanted to also give Carmina the chance to comment on what you thought of the significance of the dismissal of Cédric Herrou's case, but also we've had some other questions to you. I mean, if you know anything about the cases that we've seen in Belgium or the Netherlands about illegal entry. Also, someone rightly noticed that there don't really seem to be cases, at least that we've identified, coming out of Central Europe. There was one case in Croatia. So could you say a little bit about that? And also more generally, people are interested in the database that we've created with Rizoma. You know, what can we tell about the kinds of cases? What are we gathering? And also, how can people get in touch with you? So one last big question to you, but just answer what you can. And again, people can get in touch with everyone bilaterally.
Yes. First of all, on Cédric Herrou, I mean, it's very important what happened yesterday, because this is an emblematic case of criminalisation of solidarity that really had a lot of mediatic attention and also shed light on the problem back in 2017. And also led, as Lina was saying, to the French Constitutional Court ruling on the principle of fraternity. So the hope is that this will set the legal precedent also for other cases, and it will impact also, for instance, the case of Pierre Manoni, that is very similar. And if I'm not wrong, it will be tried by the same court that Cédric Herrou, that was working on the case of Cédric Herrou. So maybe in the next month we can see if there was also an impact of the Constitutional French Court on cases at lower level in France. So I think that's very important development. And also more in general, I mean, yes, in our database we have collected at least so far cases of investigation and formal prosecution that, as Lina and Sergio already said, is only a part one part of the bigger of the problem. So yeah, participants can really be in touch with us and by emails with the contact that we are sharing here, and if they are aware of any cases or investigation that is taking place in the member states on the grounds falling under the scope of the Facilitation Directive, they can really be in touch with us, and we can keep collecting the case. That this is one also our main goal of our project. And also I can say that, yeah, with regard to the central European countries, we have not identified many cases there. There is really a gap, but we have identified other problems. We have identified that it's an hostile environment. There are many obstacles, regulatory obstacles, administrative barriers that apply, that make the life of NGOs more difficult. So just the example of Hungary or Poland, where there are several obstacles to access funding or registration requirements to carry out fundamental activities, are in practice undermining the work of NGOs and volunteers. So as Lina already said, this is criminalisation of solidarity is not only formal prosecution, but also suspicious intimidation, harassment, and other problems like that.
Thank you, Carmina. I'm sorry that this webinar went over, but our Q&A section just exploded because so many of you are working directly on this. I had things that I couldn't talk about, from HIAS Lesbos, the Helsinki, the Hungarian Helsinki Committee, NGOs in Finland, in Spain. We want to continue to be gathering your information because the European Commission is this year working on guidelines that they hope to publish, and there are cases that are also coming through the courts and hopefully can be heard at the European level. And every time there are cases, good and bad, it's a chance to communicate and raise awareness and show actually that Europeans want change. So thank you so much for joining us. Please get in touch with us if you have information at CEPS Migration Policy Group or PICUM. Again, this webinar is going to be shared on YouTube and on Facebook. So reshare it, tweet Defend Solidarity, and we'll see you either on social media, eventually for meetings, who knows, maybe in front of the European Court of Justice or in front of the European Parliament. So thank you. I look forward to the next time we can meet together.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Well done.
Yes. Thank you to Chun from CEPS, who has secretly been making this whole thing possible, to Hind, who did all of the promotion coordination, a lot of the visuals, who was helping me out at frantic moments, to PICUM, to everyone else who's involved in this webinar.